Greetings, my friends. My name is Sage, and at the end of this journey, not only do I want you to be completely relaxed and asleep, but I want you to better understand Dobby's mythological and spiritual connections to Harry Potter and how instrumental he was in the end of Lord Voldemort's reign. The magic that bound Dobby was older than the manor's foundations, a deep and silent river flowing beneath the surface of his every waking moment. It was not a spell cast upon him, but a condition of his very being, woven into the tapestry of his existence from the instant his large luminous eyes first opened in the dim confines of the Malfoy elf quarters. House elves did not choose their families. The magic chose for them. An ancient familial enchantment rooted in bloodline and stone called a new elf into service whenever a bond was severed by death, or, far more rarely, by freedom. The magic was a living contract, written not on parchment but in the very air of the ancestral home, waiting for a vessel to fill. When Dobby appeared, a small shivering creature materializing from the ambient magic of the estate, the contract snapped into place. He belonged to the House of Malfoy. The manor was his world, its walls the boundaries of his soul. This bond was a complex, brutal architecture of compulsion and paradox. At its core was the primal link to the physical dwelling. The manor was not just Dobby's workplace, it was an extension of his magical core. Its floors knew the patter of his feet, its dust yielded to his snap. Its hidden corners were as familiar to him as his own knobbly fingers. He could feel the house's moods in the creak of its floorboards, a cold disdain when the masters were angry, a hollow silence when they were away, a tense anticipation before a grand, cruel party. Leaving its grounds was not merely forbidden, it was a metaphysical agony, a stretching and tearing of the magical tether that felt like his skin was being peeled slowly from his body. The bond compelled obedience to the direct orders of those whose blood owned the enchantment. A command from Lucius or Narcissa Malfoy rang inside Dobby's skull with the clarity of a bell, a directive his magic and muscles were forced to enact, regardless of his own will. The compulsion was so absolute that to even contemplate refusing a clear order was to invite a wave of nausea and dizzying pain. Intertwined with this compulsion was a powerful taboo. A house elf could not speak ill of their masters. The magic enforced a kind of vocal censorship. Dobby could feel the words, cruel, wicked, dark, bubbling like poison in his throat, but to give them voice was to risk self-strangulation. He could hint, he could imply, he could speak in frantic circles of warning, but direct condemnation was magically inaccessible. This gag reflex was a masterstroke of the bond's design, ensuring that even an elf's thoughts, if they ever dared to crystallize into rebellion, remained trapped within, festering in silent isolation. Yet the most potent symbol of the bond, and its only known key, was clothing. This was the central sacred paradox of house elf servitude. An elf was maintained, housed, and commanded by a wizarding family, but they were never paid, and most critically, they were never given garments. A house elf's uniform, usually a simple pillowcase or tea towel, was not considered clothing in the magical sense. It was a marker of their station, provided by the family, but not given as a gift. The act of a master formally presenting an elf with an article of clothing, a sock, a hat, a glove, was a ritual of release. The magic interpreted this not as a reward, but as a severance of the contract. To give clothes was to say, "You are no longer my responsibility. You must dress yourself." It was a symbolic dismissal that triggered a literal, magical unbinding. the enchantments woven into the elf's being recognised this gesture as the termination of agreement, and with a silent, internal snap, the bonds would fall away. Every elf knew this. For most, the knowledge was a source of terror, for freedom was a vast, terrifying unknown. For Dobby, that knowledge was a secret star he navigated by, a distant, shimmering possibility that lived in the same heart that ached with the compulsion to obey. The sock in this world was not just footwear, it was a writ of emancipation, waiting for a hand foolish or kind enough to offer it. The magic that bound Dobby was older than the manor's foundations, a deep and silent river flowing beneath the surface of his every waking moment. It was not a spell cast upon him, but a condition of his very being, woven into the tapestry of his existence from the instant his large, luminous eyes first opened in the dim confines of the Malfoy elf quarters. House elves did not choose their families, the magic chose for them. An ancient, familial enchantment rooted in bloodline and stone called a new elf into service whenever a bond was severed by death, or, far more rarely, by freedom. The magic was a living contract, written not on parchment but in the very air of the ancestral home, waiting for a vessel to fill. When Dobby appeared, a small shivering creature materializing from the ambient magic of the estate, the contract snapped into place. He belonged to the House of Malfoy. The manor was his world, its walls the boundaries of his soul. This bond was a complex, brutal architecture of compulsion and paradox. At its core was the primal link to the physical dwelling. The manor was not just Dobby's workplace, it was an extension of his magical core. Its floors knew the patter of his feet, its dust yielded to his snap. Its hidden corners were as familiar to him as his own knobbly fingers. He could feel the house's moods in the creak of its floorboards, a cold disdain when the masters were angry, a hollow silence when they were away, a tense anticipation before a grand, cruel party. Leaving its grounds was not merely forbidden, it was a metaphysical agony, a stretching and tearing of the magical tether that felt like his skin was being peeled slowly from his body. The bond compelled obedience to the direct orders of those whose blood owned the enchantment. A command from Lucius or Narcissa Malfoy rang inside Dobby's skull with the clarity of a bell, a directive his magic and muscles were forced to enact, regardless of his own will. The compulsion was so absolute that to even contemplate refusing a clear order was to invite a wave of nausea and dizzying pain. Intertwined with this compulsion was a powerful taboo. A house elf could not speak ill of their masters. The magic enforced a kind of vocal censorship. Dobby could feel the words, cruel, wicked, dark, bubbling like poison in his throat, but to give them voice was to risk self-strangulation. He could hint, he could imply, he could speak in frantic circles of warning, but direct condemnation was magically inaccessible. This gag reflex was a masterstroke of the bond's design, ensuring that even an elf's thoughts, if they ever dared to crystallize into rebellion, remained trapped within, festering in silent isolation. Yet the most potent symbol of the bond, and its only known key, was clothing. This was the central sacred paradox of house elf servitude. An elf was maintained, housed, and commanded by a wizarding family, but they were never paid, and most critically, they were never given garments. A house elf's uniform, usually a simple pillowcase or tea towel, was not considered clothing in the magical sense. It was a marker of their station, provided by the family but not given as a gift. The act of a master formally presenting an elf with an article of clothing, a sock, a hat, a glove, was a ritual of release. The magic interpreted this not as a reward, but as a severance of the contract. To give clothes was to say, "You are no longer my responsibility. You must dress yourself." It was a symbolic dismissal that triggered a literal, magical unbinding. The enchantments woven into the elf's being recognized this gesture as the termination of agreement, and with a silent, internal snap, the bonds would fall away. Every elf knew this. For most, the knowledge was the source of terror. For freedom was a vast, terrifying unknown. For Dobby, that knowledge was a secret star he navigated by, a distant, shimmering possibility that lived in the same heart that ached with the compulsion to obey. The sock in this world was not just footwear, it was a rite of emancipation, waiting for a hand foolish or kind enough to offer it. The origins of this magic were shrouded in the mist of early wizarding history, likely born from the same brutal, pragmatic spells that ancient families used to bind land, treasure, and magical creatures to their bloodlines. It was old magic, deep magic, operating on principles of symbolic exchange and absolute ownership that modern wizards had largely abandoned for more precise, wand-focused charms. The bond was not a single enchantment but a layered series of them, a geas of obedience, a tether of location, a vow of silence, all sealed with the ritual clause of clothing. It was a system designed to be perpetual, self-reinforcing, and inescapable, creating a servant who was both magically powerful and utterly subjugated. The magic flowed from the family's ancestral magic, sustained by their continued ownership of the home and their status. It was why old, wealthy, pure-blood families like the Malfoys had large retinues of elves. Their magical footprint was vast and dark, demanding many small-bound souls to maintain its grim splendour. Dobby's magic was thus never truly his own. It was a loan from the bond itself, a current he could channel but never source. He could make the silver polish itself and the dust vanish with a thought, but that power was contingent upon his servitude, a tool provided for the upkeep of his prison. The bond magic was a perfect, terrible circle, and within it, Dobby lived every second of his life, feeling its contours as acutely as the ragged fabric of his pillowcase. The bond magic granted Dobby power of a kind that would make most wizards gasp with envy. Yet it was a power that underscored his bondage with cruel irony. For a house elf's magic, vast and instinctual, operated under one supreme restriction. It was solely for service. Dobby could perform feats of wandless magic that required immense concentration and skill from a human wizard. With a snap of his long fingers, he could apparate within the enchanted confines of Malfoy Manor, a place where human apparition was impossible. Appearing silently in any room to attend to a dropped napkin or a muttered desire for tea, he could levitate entire banquet tables, mend shattered heirlooms with a touch and scour stone floors until they gleamed, all without uttering a word. This magic was an extension of his bond, a resource provided by the ancient enchantments to better serve the household. It was efficient, silent, and profoundly powerful. Yet it was a bird flying in a gilded cage. The magic could do anything for the home and the family, but nothing for the elf himself. This paradox manifested most painfully in the elf's inability to use that same magic for self-liberation. Dobby could vanish a mountain of dirty laundry with a thought, but he could not vanish the bonds that chained him. He could apparate across the manor to obey an order, but he could not apparate beyond its gates to freedom. The magic that flowed so readily at his command for service would simply stutter and die if directed toward his own emancipation. It was as if the enchantment had a built-in filter, a magical governor that diverted all power back into the system of servitude. He could, in theory, pick up a wizard's wand, but it would be a useless stick in his hands. His magic was not compatible with such tools, rooted as it was in the bond and the home. His power was a key that unlocked every door in the prison, except the one that led outside. Disobedience or failure did not merely earn a scolding, it triggered an automatic, magical self-punishment. The bond magic contained a brutal justice system that operated independently of the master's whims. When Dobby spoke out of turn or failed in a task, a deep, internal compulsion would seize him, demanding penance. His own magic, the very force he used to serve, would turn against him. He would be driven to punish himself, often by beating his head against the nearest wall or ironing his own fingers on a hot stove. The magic compelled the action, and his own formidable power ensured it was carried out with terrible force. These acts were not theatrical displays for the master's benefit. They were a mandatory, magical correction, a resetting of the bond's equilibrium through pain. The Malfoys rarely needed to lift a wand to discipline him. The bond did it for them, more efficiently and cruelly than they ever could. Dobby's small body was a tapestry of old burns and faint scars, each a silent testament to a thought, a word, or a task that strayed from absolute compliance. Psychologically, this system crafted a perfect servant. The constant, low-grade awareness of the bond, coupled with the ever-present threat of autonomous punishment, created a mindset where the very concept of freedom became alien and terrifying. For most house elves, to be free was to be untethered, useless, adrift in a world with no purpose. Their identity was the bond. Their worth was measured in service. The idea of choosing, of acting on one's own desires, was not liberating, but profoundly lonely and frightening. The bond magic, over centuries, had shaped not just their duties but their very consciousness, breeding a species that viewed servitude as natural, honourable, and safe. Rebellion was not just an act of defiance, it was a form of existential madness. This made Dobby's inner yearning not merely rebellious, but revolutionary. While the bond magic worked tirelessly to sculpt his mind into the accepted shape, something within him resisted the final mould. His desire for freedom was a flaw in the enchantment's perfect geometry, a crack through which a strange, terrifying light seeped. He felt the terror of liberty. Yes, the vast, yawning unknown of it chilled him to his core, but he also felt its allure. This internal conflict was his private torment. To yearn for what the magic defined as catastrophe was a constant, low-grade violation of the bond, one that sometimes triggered those fits of self-punishment all on its own, as if his very thoughts were treasonous. His goodness, his innate sense of justice, became a rebellious force, clashing against the psychological prison the bond had built. Where other elves found comfort in the clear lines of servitude, Dobby found only suffocation. His magic was a mighty river, but it flowed in a channel dug by ancient, cruel hands. His deepest wish was not to dam the river, but to change its course, to let it flow toward a horizon he could not yet see, even if the thought of that new landscape filled him with equal parts dread and desperate hope. The bond's magic was designed to make an elf fear freedom more than any punishment, to make the cage feel like home. For Dobby, the cage had never felt like anything but a cage, and that singular, painful awareness was the first and most profound spell he ever broke, long before a sock ever changed hands. The rebellion began not with a shout, but with a whisper of static from the forbidden wireless. In the oppressive silence of the Malfoy Manor cellar, amidst barrels of pickled ingredients and discarded furniture, Dobby had carved out a secret hollow. Here, behind a false panel in the stone wall, he kept his treasures. A chipped teacup filled with colourful thread, a smooth river stone, and a magically modified wizarding wireless set. The latter was his greatest act of clandestine magic, a tiny, desperate triumph over the bond. He had painstakingly altered its runes over months, using stolen moments and magic meant for polishing silver, so it would operate silently, its sound channeled directly into his large bat-like ears alone. Through this illicit device, the wider world seeped into his prison. It was through the wireless that he first heard the name that would change everything: Harry Potter. The reports were fragmented, sensational. The boy who lived, the defeater of he who must not be named. Now a student at Hogwarts, but other, darker whispers followed on enchanted eavesdropping spells Dobby dared to cast, listening to the fragments of conversation that drifted down from the drawing room. He heard Lucius Malfoy's cold, drawling voice speak of plots, of a dangerous artifact meant to purge the school, of a threat to the famous boy. The combination ignited a fire in Dobby's chest. Here was a child who had faced the darkness his own masters revered and had triumphed. Here was a boy who was good, in a world that seemed to reward cruelty, and here was a plot, hatched under this very roof, to harm him. The compulsion of the bond screamed at Dobby to ignore it, to focus on his duties, but a newer, fiercer compulsion, his own, took root. Harry Potter must be protected. His decision to intervene was an earthquake in his soul. Every instinct bred by the bond magic recoiled. To act against his master's interests, even indirectly, was the deepest betrayal. Yet the image of the boy, an orphan facing darkness just as he faced the darkness of the manor, would not leave him. Dobby's plan was a frantic, clumsy thing, born of desperation and a complete misunderstanding of the human world. His first attempt to protect Harry was to stop him from returning to Hogwarts, believing the school to be the seat of danger. Apparating to the human world, to the dreadfully ordinary number 4 Privet Drive, was an agony that felt like his bones were being ground to dust. The bond magic fought his every mile, a burning leash yanking at his core. He appeared in Harry's bedroom, a small terrified figure in the dark, and unleashed a simple, devastating charm. He magicked away the letters that might have carried his warning, and with a great wrenching effort of will, he stole the very air from the space between the floor and the door, creating a vacuum seal that trapped his hero. The result was not a saved Harry Potter, but a furious, imprisoned one, and the arrival of a howling magical warning from the Ministry of Magic. Dobby fled, his heart hammering with failure and the searing pain of the bond's retaliation for his unauthorized journey. Undeterred, his resolve hardened by his own suffering, he tried again. The whispers spoke of a plot involving a Quidditch match. Dobby, who understood little of sports but much about airborne danger, acted. Securing a bludger, a heavy iron ball designed for violence, from the manor's abandoned game room, he poured his fear and his powerful, misdirected magic into it. He enchanted it with a single-minded, terrible purpose: find Harry Potter. Then again, enduring the excruciating tear of apparition, beyond his boundaries, he smuggled it into the Hogwarts Quidditch pitch. From a hidden perch he watched in mounting horror as his spell worked too well. The rogue bludger became a relentless, homing missile, hunting Harry through the sky with murderous intent. Dobby's large eyes filled with tears as he saw the boy thrown from his broom, his arm shattered by the very enchantment meant to save him. This was not protection, this was catastrophe. His well-intentioned defiance had nearly killed the person he sought to champion. The aftermath was a torrent of guilt and a terrifying resolve. Harry was in the hospital wing. The plot, Dobby knew, was still in motion. He had to deliver a clear warning, no matter the cost. The journey to Hogwarts this time was a pilgrimage of pain. Each apparition jump was a lightning bolt of agony along the bond's tether, a sensation of his very spirit being flayed. He appeared in the Hogwarts hospital wing, a small shivering wreck, his ears drooping, his eyes bloodshot with effort and self-inflicted punishment for his many disobediences. The sight of Harry Potter, pale and bandaged in a white bed, broke him. The bond's taboo fought against his confession, but his need to speak was greater. Words tumbled out in a frantic, sobbing rush, warnings about the Chamber of Secrets, about the plot, about the terrible danger. He spoke in circles, beating his head against the iron bed frame whenever he neared a direct accusation of the Malfoys. The bond's punishment flaring automatically. It was a performance of utter anguish, a being tearing itself in two. He confessed to the letters, to the bludger, his voice thick with remorse. He was not a clever saviour, he was a desperate creature, trying and failing to navigate a world of shadows with only a flicker of his own moral light to guide him. In that raw, tearful confession, amidst pain and failure, something pivotal was forged. Harry Potter, instead of anger, showed a dawning understanding. He saw not a nuisance, but a being in torment, risking everything to do what he thought was right. In that sterile room, an alliance was born, not from strength, but from shared recognition of injustice. Dobby, for the first time, had not just rebelled in secret. He had reached out, and someone had reached back. The spark, fanned by failure and pain, now had the oxygen of hope. The dungeon beneath Malfoy Manor was a mouth of cold, wet stone, a place where hope seemed to seep into the mortar and vanish. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and a sharper, metallic tang of fear. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and the Wandmaker Ollivander were trapped in the lightless space. Their captivity, a raw, physical weight. Above them, the house thrummed with a malevolent energy. The footsteps of snatchers and the cold laughter of Bellatrix Lestrange echoing like distant thunder. But the true centre of the darkness was Lucius Malfoy, whose arrogance had curdled into a desperate, fraying menace. His once proud demeanour was gaunt, his eyes fever-bright with the need to please the Dark Lord, who now occupied his home. He saw in his captives not people, but commodities, keys to his own restoration. His voice, when it slithered down the stairs, was a study in venomous entitlement, the sound of a man who believed the universe owed him obedience, especially from those he considered property. The chaos of the rescue erupted not with a spell, but with a soft pop that was almost swallowed by the dungeon's gloom. Dobby appeared between one ragged breath and the next, his large eyes wide with terror and determination. The journey to this place, to defy his former masters so utterly, must have been an agony beyond comprehension, a journey through fire made of his own bond magic. Yet there he stood, a small thin figure in a grimy pillowcase, a beacon of impossible courage. The ensuing moments were a blur of frantic motion. Dobby's small hands gripped Harry and the others with a strength that belied his size. The world twisted, the dungeon walls dissolving into the nauseating compression of side-along apparition. They rematerialized, not in safety, but in the manicured hell of the manor's drawing room, amidst splintered crystal and Bellatrix's shrieks. Spells flashed like malignant lightning. Dobby moved with a frantic, protective grace, his magic, powerful, wandless, and born of service, now wielded as a shield. He vanished a falling chandelier aimed at their heads, diverted a killing curse with a wave of his hand that made the air shimmer. His every action a defiant repurposing of the magic that had bound him. The frantic escape led them back to the cellar's edge, a bottleneck of panic. Lucius Malfoy stood there, blocking their retreat to the outside world, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. To see his own elf, that pathetic, snivelling creature, orchestrating this rebellion was an insult that burned hotter than any spell. He screamed orders, commands that once would have frozen Dobby in his tracks. But the elf flinched, and yet did not stop, his will battling the ghost echo of the bond. In that suspended second, Harry's mind, sharpened by desperation, saw not a wizard, but a proud, careless man, used to being handed what he demanded. Harry's fingers closed around the one object he had managed to seize in the tumult, a worn, leather-bound book. With a swift, hidden motion, he tore the thin cotton from his own injured foot, stuffing the filthy, balled-up sock deep into the book's pages. He thrust the book toward Lucius, his voice cutting through the din with a forced, pleading urgency, offering it as a prize, a token. Lucius, his contempt for the elf absolute, his focus on the object, and not the gesture, snatched it. He barely glanced at it before turning his fury back toward Dobby, who was shepherding the others toward the stairs. "Here!" Lucius spat, his voice dripping with disgust, and he hurled the book not at Harry, but directly at the elf he wished to punish. "Take it, you useless creature, and get out of my sight." Dobby, reacting instinctively to an object thrown by his master, caught the book against his narrow chest. The moment his long fingers touched the leather, he felt it. Not the weight of the pages, but the soft, folded fabric within. His entire body went rigid. A shock, cold and bright, travelled from the tips of his fingers to the core of his being. The world did not explode in light and sound. Instead, it fell into a profound, ringing silence. Within him, something ancient and immutable, something he had felt with every heartbeat since his first breath, simply ceased. It was not a breaking, but an unbinding, a silent internal snap, clean and final. The magical tethers that tied him to the blood of Malfoy, to the stones of the manor, to the very concept of servitude, dissolved like smoke in a sudden wind. The constant, low-grade pressure in his skull, the compulsion to obey, vanished, leaving a dizzying, terrifying emptiness in its wake. The taboo that had strangled his criticisms melted away from his throat. The magical leash that had made every step beyond the gates an agony simply was no longer there. He stood, holding the book, a free elf. For a second, there was only the silence and the shock on Lucius Malfoy's face, as he realised what he had done. Then Dobby looked down at the sock, which had tumbled from the pages onto the stone floor. He did not pick it up. He simply stared at it, this humble, grimy piece of cloth that was worth more than all the gold in Gringotts. When he raised his head, his enormous eyes were filled with a light that had never been allowed to shine in the manor's shadows. His voice, when it came, was tremulous, soft with awe, yet it carried through the frozen scene with the clarity of a bell. "Dobby is free." The declaration hung in the damp air. Then the power of that freedom, no longer channeled solely for service, surged through him for the first time. As Lucius, with a roar of pure fury, raised his wand to curse the elf who was now beyond his reach, Dobby did not cower. He raised his own hand, not in submission, but in defiance. A wave of raw, protective magic, entirely his own, erupted from him. It was not the neat, efficient magic of polishing silver, but something wilder, stronger. It struck Lucius Malfoy, not with violence, but with overwhelming force, lifting the wizard off his feet and hurling him backward into the dark wall with a satisfying, heavy thud. The magic that had once bound Dobby to obey this man was now the power that cast him aside. In that moment, the price of a sock was paid in full, and a new kind of magic, born of choice and loyalty, took its first glorious breath. The world beyond the manor's gates was a vast, terrifying, and beautiful symphony of choice. For Dobby, freedom was not a single moment of release in a dusty cellar, but a daily, dizzying negotiation with an existence suddenly brimming with possibility. The first few days were a sensory overload. The sky was not a ceiling of oppressive stone, but an endless, shifting canvas of cloud and light. The wind carried scents of grass, lake water, and baking bread instead of polished dark wood and contempt. Every decision, from where to stand to when to sleep, was his own, and the sheer weight of that autonomy was at times paralysing. The ghost of the bond lingered as a phantom limb, a habitual flinch at a raised voice, a reflexive urge to punish himself for a minor mistake, a deep-seated terror that this liberty was a mistake that would be violently corrected. Yet, with each sunrise, he witnessed because he chose to, not because a master demanded pre-dawn tea. The phantom ache lessened. His sanctuary, his chosen home, became Hogwarts. The castle, with its ancient, humming magic and chaotic warmth, was the antithesis of Malfoy Manor. Here, magic felt playful, protective, and alive. Professor Dumbledore, with eyes that seemed to perceive the very shape of Dobby's newfound soul, offered him not a command, but a contract. The negotiation in the headmaster's office was a quiet revolution. Dobby, standing on a squashy armchair to meet the wizard's gaze, asked for wages, 1 galleon a week, and holidays, 1 day a month. The requests were spoken with a tremor, as if expecting a lightning bolt of retribution for such audacity. Dumbledore's agreement was immediate, his twinkling eyes solemn. The galleon was not payment for labour, it was a symbol, a tangible acknowledgement that Dobby's work had value and that he was a being with economic agency. The holiday was even more profound, a scheduled interval where his time was incontrovertibly his own. These were the foundational stones upon which Dobby built his new identity. His work at Hogwarts became a source of profound, gleaming pride. He was appointed a Hogwarts house elf, but the title felt different. He was not bound to the castle by ancient magic. He was allied with it by choice. He took particular care of the Gryffindor common room, ensuring the fires were always cheery, the brass fittings gleamed, and the squashy armchairs were perpetually plump and inviting. He developed a specialty for difficult, delicate cleaning, restoring tarnished silver trophies in the display cases, gently teasing dust from the pages of fragile library books without a whisper of damage. His magic, once a tool of servitude, became an expression of meticulous care. He worked not from compulsion, but from a place of fierce ownership and belonging. He would often pause, a polishing rag in hand, to simply gaze out a mullioned window at the grounds, his chest swelling with a quiet, unshakable joy. This was his work. He was paid for it. The concepts were marvels. His fashion choices, a source of bewilderment to many, were his declaration of self. Freed from the drab uniformity of a pillowcase, Dobby embraced attire with a riotous, heartfelt enthusiasm. He collected discarded garments and oddments, treating each not as mere cloth, but as a trophy of his liberty. His outfits were spectacular collisions of pattern and texture. 7 different woolly hats stacked atop his head, a mismatched pair of socks pulled up to his knobbly knees, a waistcoat fashioned from a tartan tea cosy worn over a football jersey. He wore a necktie as a belt and a single oven mitt as a prized accessory. To wizards it was eccentricity. To Dobby, every clashing colour, every absurd combination was a verse in a poem of freedom. Each garment was a choice, a rejection of imposed uniformity, a wearable celebration of the right to be exactly, gloriously himself. At the heart of this new life was his relationship with Harry Potter, which evolved into something rare and deeply mutual. There was no servitude, only a friendship forged in defiance and sealed by a sock. Dobby's help was never given out of obligation, but from a wellspring of fierce, personal loyalty. He took to visiting Harry, often appearing with a pop in the Gryffindor dormitory to present a small gift, a batch of freshly baked muffins he'd persuaded the kitchens to make, a pair of socks he had knitted himself with slightly uneven stitches but immense pride. He called Harry the Great Harry Potter, but the title had shed its earlier desperation. It was now an affectionate nickname, imbued with the warmth of shared history. Harry, in turn, treated Dobby with a respect that was simple, direct, and revolutionary. He asked for help. He never demanded. He thanked him sincerely. He remembered his holidays. In Harry's presence, Dobby felt not like a former elf, but like a friend. This redefinition of master was Dobby's most subtle and powerful magic. The word did not vanish from his vocabulary, but its meaning transformed entirely. Harry Potter is Dobby's master, he would say proudly, but the context shimmered with new truth. It meant Harry Potter is the friend Dobby chooses to help. It signified a bond of loyalty, freely given and reciprocated with kindness. This evolved understanding found its greatest expression in the formation of Dumbledore's army. When Harry needed a secret, safe place for the students to learn defensive magic, it was Dobby he trusted. And Dobby, with a conspiratorial gleam in his large eyes, became the guardian of the Room of Requirement. He alone knew its secret, watching over the comings and goings of the rebellious students with a proprietary pride. He would tidy the space after meetings, leaving it spotless, and once left a plate of fudge on the table for them, a silent gesture of solidarity. His role was not one of subservience, but of partnership in resistance. This culminated in his most daring act of chosen service. When Professor Umbridge and the Inquisitorial Squad discovered the group, it was Dobby who, risking his own hard-won position, raced through the castle to warn Harry, his small form a blur of desperate loyalty. He helped orchestrate the escape, his magic ensuring the evidence vanished, protecting the very idea of the army he helped enable. In these actions, Dobby was no one's servant. He was a comrade, a protector, a free elf exercising his boundless will in defense of his friends and the future they dared to imagine. His life in freedom was a daily, vibrant proof that liberty was not an end point, but a beginning, a space in which he could finally fully become himself. The summons was not a sound, but a feeling, a sudden cold pull in the centre of Dobby's chest where his loyalty lived. He was in the Hogwarts kitchens, admiring a newly knitted tea-cosy hat when the world seemed to tilt. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that Harry Potter was in mortal peril. Not the ordinary dangers of school or battle, but a deep, dark terror emanating from a place he knew in his bones. The dungeons of Malfoy Manor. The connection forged by a sock and years of chosen friendship had become its own kind of bond. A tether of devotion, that now rang like an alarm. Without a second's hesitation, without consulting a soul, Dobby vanished from the warm, bustling kitchen with a soft crack. He appeared not at the manor itself, its wards would have repelled even his free magic, but in the wind-swept darkness just beyond its boundaries. The sight of the grim silhouette against the stormy sky sent a shiver through him that was pure memory. But the fear was secondary now, drowned by a single, imperative purpose. He could feel Harry's desperation, like a physical vibration in the air. Focusing his powerful magic, he pinpointed the location not of a person, but of a plea. With another wrenching twist of apparition, he materialized inside the very cellar he had once been freed from. The scene was one of frozen horror. Harry and his friends were trapped, Bellatrix Lestrange's mad laughter echoing from above, the threat of imminent discovery hanging thick as fog. Dobby's large eyes took it all in, the paleness of their faces, the grip of their hands. He did not speak, he acted. His small hand seized Harry's arm with a grip of iron, his other hand reaching for the other's. The magic he summoned was not the neat, domestic magic of Hogwarts, but something raw and powerful, fueled by urgency and love. The world dissolved into the crushing tunnel of side-along apparition, but this journey was chaotic, violent. They were not simply travelling, they were tearing themselves from a place that wanted to keep them. They rematerialized briefly in a tumble of limbs on the manor's gravel drive, spells already slicing the air around them. Bellatrix's shriek of rage was a physical thing. What followed was a masterpiece of protective magic, a testament to what a free elf could do. Dobby moved with a preternatural grace, his every action precise and devastating. He did not duel, he defended. A silver knife thrown by a snatcher vanished in mid-air with a snap of his fingers. A stunning spell ricocheted off an invisible shield he conjured with a wave of his hand. He apparated them in short dizzying bursts, fractions of a second ahead of curses, his magic weaving a protective web around the fleeing group. He was not a warrior, but a guardian. His power, once used to maintain a prison, now deployed to create a pathway to salvation. Each feat was impeccable, instinctual, a perfect harmony of immense power and selfless intent. The final jump was meant for safety, for the seashell-strewn peace of Shell Cottage. They materialized on a bluff overlooking the churning sea, the salt air a shock after the manor's damp decay. For a heartbeat, it seemed they had made it. Relief, raw and dizzying, began to bloom. Harry turned, his mouth opening to speak his thanks, to see his friend. It was then that Bellatrix Lestrange's last, spiteful act found its mark. The silver knife, thrown with all her manic hatred as they vanished, had not been aimed at a wizard. It had been aimed at the elf, the betrayer, the symbol of defiance she could not abide. It traced a silent, deadly arc through the space where they had been and followed the magical wake of their apparition. It appeared as if from a tear in the world itself, a glint of cruel silver in the grey coastal light. Dobby, standing closest to the point of arrival, his large eyes wide with the triumph of their escape, did not see it. There was no sound. The knife simply was, and then it was buried to the hilt in his narrow chest. He looked down, not with shock, but with a kind of gentle surprise, as if noticing a dropped stitch in one of his beloved socks. His knees buckled. Harry was there before he hit the ground, catching the small light body, lowering him gently onto the cool grass. The others stood frozen, the roar of the sea suddenly deafening. Dobby's breathing was a shallow, wet rasp. His gaze found Harry's, and the terror the pain seemed to recede, replaced by a profound luminous peace. The cottage, the friends, the sky, he saw it all. His hand with its long fingers twitched toward Harry. "Harry Potter," the voice was a whisper, softer than the sea foam. It was not a title of awe now, but a name, spoken with the intimacy of a final gift. A small, blissful smile touched his lips. Such a beautiful place to be with friends. His eyes, those great lamp-like eyes that had seen so much cruelty and so much kindness, held Harry's for one last silent moment. The light in them did not fade violently, but gently, like a candle guttering in a safe, quiet room. Then, with a final soft sigh, Dobby the free elf was still. The grief that followed was a quiet, tectonic force. Harry refused all offers of magical help. With his own bleeding hands, he dug a grave in the soft earth behind Shell Cottage, each shovelful of dirt a testament, each blister a prayer. The physical labour was a necessary pain, a feeble echo of the sacrifice made for him. He lined the grave with stones from the beach, a bed fit for a hero. When he placed Dobby in the earth, he did so with infinite care, arranging the small form as if for sleep. He fashioned the marker himself, carving the letters with a conjured knife into a smooth piece of driftwood. The epitaph was simple, definitive, and revolutionary. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf." It was not a statement of what he had become, but of what he had always been in his heart, finally and forever recognised. In that act of manual burial, Harry internalised the cost of their war. Dobby's death stripped away the last vestiges of abstract ideology, hardening his resolve into something cold, sharp and unbreakable. The fight was no longer about destiny or prophecy. It was for the small, the kind, the brave who asked for nothing but a sock and gave everything in return. Dobby's legacy did not end in that seaside grave. It rippled outwards, changing the magical world in subtle, indelible ways. He became a symbol, not just for house elves, but for all who fought against tyranny. His story of inherent goodness surviving cruelty, of courage defying magical compulsion, of a friendship that crossed the deepest societal divides, was told and retold. He proved that the smallest being could cast the longest shadow. At Hogwarts, in the years that followed, other elves would sometimes be seen wearing more than one sock, or a brightly coloured hat without shame. The demand for proper wages and rights, while still a struggle, gained a face and a name that could not be dismissed. He had redefined loyalty, transforming it from enforced servitude to chosen devotion. He had shown that freedom was not an end to purpose, but its beginning. And for those who knew him, who saw him fall on the green cliff, his legacy was a quiet, enduring truth. That the most powerful magic of all was not in wands or words, but in the boundless, brave heart of a friend who chose, again and again, to be kind. In the end, Dobby did not just win his freedom. He forever changed the meaning of the word for everyone who came after. As we approach the end of this story, you may find yourself dozing off to sleep, or becoming dreary-eyed, or maybe you're already asleep. In either case, it is time for me to fade away and let the dreams take it from here. Have a good night and enjoy some crackles from the fireplace to help you drift further into your deep slumber.